My father stood shoulder to shoulder, with federal security guards blocking my path at the entrance to the most exclusive event in Washington. He looked me up and down, laughed, and said I was not important enough to stand there. He told me to stop embarrassing the family and fetch someone in charge. I swallowed the insult, holding the clipboard that controlled the entire evening. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink. I simply nodded to the head hostess, who stepped forward and announced my real title to the entire room. But before the Secret Service escorted my family out into the cold, you need to understand how we got to that door. I am 33 years old, and my brain organizes the entire world into columns. Assets on the left side, liabilities on the right. Some people read body language to figure out if they are loved. I read bank statements. It was a Tuesday evening, raining hard enough to rattle the single-pane windows of my modest one-bedroom apartment in Arlington. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm tea. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the room. On the screen was the transfer confirmation portal for my bank. The cursor blinked steadily inside a little white box. $4,000. That was the number my father Richard had demanded exactly 22 minutes earlier. The phone call had gone the way all our phone calls go. He did not ask how my day was. He did not ask if I was healthy or happy or tired. He called me from his home office in Ohio, his voice loud and frantic over the sound of a television playing in the background. A hydraulic pump on his main excavator had blown, he claimed. If he did not get the cash to fix it by tomorrow morning, he would lose a massive commercial contract and the whole family would go under. I am a woman who deals with multi-million-dollar philanthropic budgets for a living. I know exactly what a hydraulic pump costs. I know the lead time on ordering heavy machinery parts. I also know what genuine desperation sounds like, and my father did not sound desperate. He sounded annoyed. He sounded like a man angry at a vending machine that was taking too long to drop his snack. I had tried to ask him about the vendor. I'd asked if the mechanic could send me an invoice directly so I could pay the shop instead of wiring cash to his personal checking account. That was when my mother, Patricia, had grabbed the phone from him. Her voice had that sharp, practiced edge she uses when she wants to shut down a conversation immediately. She did not yell. She just dropped her tone into a disappointed sigh that was designed to make me feel like a cruel, ungrateful child. She asked me how I could interrogate my own father when he was under so much stress. She reminded me that he had put food on my plate for 18 years, and now I was treating him like a criminal over a few $1,000s. Then she delivered the line she always delivers, the one she uses to end every financial discussion we have ever had. Family takes care of family, Clara. I typed the $4,000 into the box. I checked the routing number. I clicked submit. I watched the little green check mark appear, confirming that my own safety net had just gotten smaller, so his could stay intact. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. My apartment is perfectly fine, but it is not the home of a wealthy woman. I drive a 7-year-old sedan. I buy my work suits off the clearance rack. I meal prep on Sundays to save money on lunches. If you looked at my life from the outside, you would completely agree with my family's assessment of me. To my parents and my sister, I'm just Clara, the glorified secretary who moved to Washington, D.C. to push papers across a desk. They genuinely believe I answer phones for mid-level bureaucrats and file expense reports all day. My mother loves to tell her friends at church that I have a safe, boring little government job. She says it with a pitying smile, the kind of smile you give someone who has settled for mediocrity. They mock me for it at every holiday dinner. My father jokes about my meager government pension. He asks if I have learned how to use the copy machine yet. I let them laugh. I never correct them. I never tell them the truth. The truth is that I am the deputy director of the National Heritage Endowment. I do not answer phones. I direct a massive federal agency that controls hundreds of millions of dollars in cultural grants. I plan elite, highly classified events for senators, foreign dignitaries, and billionaire donors. I hold security clearances that my father could not even pronounce. My signature authorizes funding that shapes the cultural landscape of entire cities. I have a corner office with a view of the Capitol building and a team of 40 people who report directly to me. But I keep that office and that title a total secret from the people who share my last name. You might wonder why a grown woman would hide her own success from her family. You hide your success when your family operates on a very specific emotional currency, and that currency is your sister. Haley is 29 years old. She is loud, she is demanding, and she is what my mother calls a creative spirit. In reality, Haley is a failed social media influencer who treats every room she enters like a stage where she is the only paid actor. If I had ever walked into my parents' house in Ohio and announced that I was a deputy director, the attention would have shifted to me for roughly 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, Haley would have thrown a tantrum so catastrophic that my mother would have spent the next 6 months punishing me for upsetting the golden child. I learned early on that making myself small was the only way to keep the peace. I learned to wear gray so Haley could wear neon. I learned to speak softly so Haley could shout. I learned to be invisible so that my sister could consume all the oxygen in the room without feeling threatened. But making myself small did not mean making myself useless. In the logic of my family, useless children are discarded. Useful children are kept around as long as they pay their dues. So I paid. I bought my place in the family piece by piece, year by year. I became the silent, dependable bank. When Haley decided she absolutely needed a lavish destination-style wedding at a vineyard she could not afford, the family turned to the boring secretary to cover the gap. My parents claimed their funds were tied up in investments. They promised to pay me back after the harvest season. I knew they were lying, but I paid the florist anyway. I paid the caterer. I quietly covered the deposit for the string quartet, draining my own savings so Haley could have her perfect photos to post online for strangers. When my mother insisted that maintaining her country club membership was vital for the family's social standing in our small Ohio town, I set up a direct debit from my checking account to cover her monthly dues. I told myself it was just a small price to pay to hear her say she loved me. I justified it by thinking that maybe if I removed all their financial stress, they would finally have the emotional bandwidth to treat me like a daughter instead of a transaction. When Richard's contracting business started bleeding money because he refused to adapt to modern building codes, I bailed him out. I covered payroll for men I had never met. I bought supplies for job sites I would never see. I transferred $4,000 on a rainy Tuesday for a hydraulic pump that I was entirely certain did not exist. I funded an illusion of prosperity for people who were fundamentally bankrupt in every sense of the word. Every single time I sent the money, I hoped for a simple thank you. I hoped for my father to say he was proud of my hard work. I hoped my mother would look at me the way she looked at Haley. But gratitude was not in their vocabulary. Every check I wrote, every crisis I solved, was met with the exact same cold, rehearsed line. Family takes care of family, Clara. They said it like a command. They said it to remind me that my money was not a gift, but a tax I owed them for the burden of my existence. I swallowed that line every time. I internalized it. I convinced myself that if I just kept paying the tax, eventually they would realize I was valuable. I thought I was purchasing their love. I did not realize I was merely funding their delusion. I sat in my dark apartment, listening to the rain hit the glass, and I thought about the $4,000 that had just left my account. I thought about the total sum of what I had given them over the last 6 years. My brain, always running the numbers, did the math effortlessly. It was a staggering figure. It was a down payment on a beautiful house in Georgetown. It was a massive retirement fund. It was a vibrant, comfortable life I was not living, so they could pretend they were thriving. I pushed away from the table and walked into my small, practical bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked at the tired lines around my eyes. I looked at the gray cardigan I had worn to work that day. I realized I had spent my entire adult life subsidizing the arrogance of people who fundamentally did not respect me. I had built a fortress of compliance around myself, hoping it would keep me safe from their criticism. But the criticism never stopped. It only adapted. They took my money and then they mocked me for being the kind of person who had to work for it. The silence of my apartment pressed in on me. I thought about the transfer I had just authorized. I thought about my father heading out to a nice dinner with my mother, completely unbothered by the financial hole he had just dug for me. I did not know it yet, but that $4,000 transfer was the final payment I would ever make to Richard and Patricia. It was the absolute end of the extortion, because within a matter of days, the delicate, expensive lie they had constructed was going to shatter, and I was going to be the one holding the hammer. The call came exactly 3 days after I wired that initial $4,000. It was a Thursday evening, and the rain was hammering against the single-pane windows of my apartment. I was sitting on my living room rug, surrounded by meticulously organized stacks of grant proposals for the upcoming fiscal quarter. My life in Washington was built on order. Every dollar was tracked, every initiative was scheduled, and every outcome was measured. When my phone vibrated roughly across the coffee table, the caller ID showed my father's name. I stared at the bright screen for a long moment. Richard never called me twice in 1 week. In fact, he rarely called me twice in an entire month, unless a bill was rapidly approaching its due date. I picked up the device and answered with a cautious greeting. I barely got the word out before his voice blasted through the small speaker. He was entirely breathless. He sounded exactly like a man who had just run a mile in heavy work boots. He launched into a chaotic, terrifying narrative. He told me his contracting business was completely underwater. He claimed the state tax board was initiating a brutal audit. His primary suppliers were filing lawsuits, and there was a massive discrepancy in the payroll taxes that the federal authorities were classifying as criminal fraud. He said he was facing actual imminent jail time. The numbers he was throwing at me were dizzying and aggressive. Penalties, back taxes, aggressive legal fees, all piling up in a mountain of impending ruin. I sat up straight on the rug, the grant proposals completely forgotten. My professional instincts kicked in immediately. I asked him to slow down. I asked him to explain the exact nature of the tax board citations so I could understand the liability. But Richard had no interest in explaining anything. He wanted to induce absolute panic. He raised his voice to a booming shout, insisting that I was refusing to listen. He declared that his entire life was about to be seized by the government and that he would be wearing handcuffs by Monday morning if he did not come up with $85,000 immediately. $85,000. The massive number hung heavy and cold in the air of my quiet apartment. This was not a broken piece of machinery. This was not a missed utility bill or a late mortgage payment. It was a life-altering sum of money. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I tried to reason with him. I told him I needed to understand the timeline and review the official notices. Before he could formulate an answer, the phone was fumbled, dropping against something hard, and my mother was suddenly on the line. Patricia did not shout. She knew exactly how to weaponize her distress in a completely different, far more devastating way. She began to cry the very second the phone touched her ear. It was a ragged, breathless, theatrical weeping that forced me to press the phone tighter against my face in alarm. She gasped out my name like a plea for salvation. She said she was absolutely terrified. She painted a vivid picture of my father pacing the hallway all night, clutching his chest in agony, unable to sleep for 4 consecutive days. She sobbed that she was entirely convinced his heart was going to give out from the sheer weight of the stress. She expertly painted a picture of absolute devastating ruin. She told me they were going to lose the only house I had ever known. She insisted the bank was going to arrive any day to seize the dining room table where we gathered for every holiday meal. She knew precisely which buttons to press. She was a master at operating the emotional switchboard of my childhood guilt. I desperately tried to interrupt her. I tried to offer my practical help in untangling the messy tax issues. I told her I knew excellent forensic accountants in Ohio who could quietly review the business files and negotiate with the state. Patricia simply sobbed louder, drowning out my logic with sheer volume. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly cold. She asked how I could comfortably sit in my secure apartment in Washington while the very people who gave me life were about to lose everything they owned. She brought up sacrifices I had been forced to hear about since I was 10 years old. She reminded me of the specific winter my father worked double shifts just to buy my heavy coat. She brought up the braces they paid for during middle school. She gathered every dollar they had ever spent on my basic survival, laid those dollars firmly at my feet, and demanded payment in full. She wailed that they had absolutely nowhere else to turn. She insisted that my sister Haley was far too fragile to handle this kind of apocalyptic news. Haley was a delicate, creative spirit. My mother wept. Haley could not bear the crushing burden of adult financial problems. I was the strong one. I was the resilient one who could carry the heavy load. The underlying message was painfully clear. I was the beast of burden required to pull the cart. Haley was the delicate flower who had to be shielded from the storm at all costs. The sheer emotional force of her crying made it nearly impossible to think straight. My chest felt incredibly tight. The panic was highly contagious, designed specifically to bypass my analytical logic and strike directly at my deepest fears of abandonment. Suddenly, my father snatched the receiver back from her hands. The weeping vanished instantly, replaced by hard, aggressive demands. He announced he had a plan to save them all. He owned a small commercial lot on the edge of town, a property he had stubbornly held onto for years. He told me he had spoken to a private expedited lender who was willing to fast-track a high-interest loan against that specific property for the entire $85,000. But because his personal credit was utterly destroyed from the business, failing the lender absolutely required a cosigner with impeccable credit and a massive verifiable income. He told me I was going to cosign the commercial loan. He said the paperwork was already being drafted by the brokers. He ordered me to expect an email with the digital forms in the morning and commanded me to sign them electronically before noon. The specific word he used was need. He did not ask for a favor. He did not request my assistance. He presented a non-negotiable demand. My analytical brain, the part of me that routinely manages complex federal budgets without breaking a sweat, finally managed to push through the heavy fog of their manufactured panic. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I told him plainly that I would not co-sign a commercial property loan without first reviewing his current profit and loss statements. I told him I needed to see the complete balance sheet. I required the name of the lending institution, the proposed interest rate, and the exact terms of the repayment schedule. Co-signing a loan meant I was legally on the hook if he defaulted, and given his disastrous financial track record, a default was practically guaranteed. I fought to keep my voice completely steady. I was desperately trying to treat the demand like a standard professional transaction. I asked him to forward the actual tax notices from the state so I could independently verify the claimed penalties. That was the precise moment Richard exploded. The phone actually crackled loudly with the sheer volume of his sudden fury. He screamed my name into the receiver. He demanded to know who exactly I thought I was dealing with. He roared that he was my father and that I had absolutely no right to interrogate my own blood. He aggressively accused me of treating him like a common criminal. He shouted that my basic demand for financial paperwork was the ultimate form of disrespect, a massive slap in the face to the man who raised me. He sneered that I was acting like a smug, greedy bank executive instead of a loyal daughter. His harsh voice rattled off the walls of my small kitchen. He delivered a brutal, unyielding ultimatum. He told me that if I did not sign those specific papers by tomorrow morning, I was completely dead to him. He swore I would no longer be welcome to step foot inside their home. He stated I could officially consider myself an orphan. He did not allow me to speak a single word in my own defense. He delivered his punishing threat, and then he slammed the phone down. The line went totally dead. And I sat frozen on my rug for a very long time. The resulting silence in my apartment was absolutely deafening. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat and hard against my thighs just to make them stop. The specific threat of being entirely disowned carries a unique kind of terror when you have spent your entire life continuously trying to earn a permanent place at the family table. It triggers a primal, desperate kind of fear. They fundamentally understood that my absolute deepest vulnerability was the terror of being cast out completely. I could not bring myself to sleep. I paced the length of my small living room for hours. I stared out the window at the blurry streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement below. If I blindly co-signed a high-interest loan with a predatory lender, it would securely tie my name to his inevitable financial ruin for years to come. It would completely wreck my own impeccable credit score. It could actively threaten my high-level security clearance at the federal agency. I simply could not risk my good name on his toxic, unseen paperwork. But the agonizing thought of never being allowed back into their home, of being completely erased from the family narrative, while Haley continued to bask in their unconditional adoration, felt like an actual physical pain expanding in my chest. I felt completely cornered. So I made the disastrous decision that people often make when they are exhausted, terrified, and desperate to make the screaming stop. I decided to bypass the dangerous loan entirely. I logged directly into my primary brokerage account. Before I transitioned to the public sector, I had worked for a major private logistics firm and slowly accumulated a significant portfolio of company stock. It was my carefully guarded safety net. It was my future down payment on a secure house. It was the absolute financial security I had built quietly with my own two hands. I sat illuminated by my laptop screen at 3 a.m. and I systematically sold $85,000 worth of my stock. I initiated the liquidation process. The standard warning prompts popped up on the bright screen asking me to confirm the massive, irrevocable transaction. I clicked the confirm button. I watched the shares vanish from my portfolio. The cash equivalent would be fully available to wire by Friday morning. I was going to hand him the cash outright, just to keep my clean name off his toxic loan documents, and to essentially buy my way back into his good graces. I tried to tell myself it was a necessary investment in my family's survival. I tried to tell myself that surely after this massive gesture, they would finally see my true value. Surely this life-altering sacrifice would conclusively prove that I was just as worthy of their love and respect as my sister. Friday morning arrived with gray skies. The liquidated funds cleared smoothly into my primary checking account. I pulled up the secure wire transfer portal. I carefully typed in his routing number. I typed in the requested amount. $85,000. It took less than 30 seconds to permanently transfer a sum of money that had taken me years of relentless work to build. I watched the final confirmation screen load completely. I took a clear screenshot of the digital receipt and sent it directly to my father in a text message. I wrote a short accommodating note stating the money was safely in his account, that he did not need to take out the risky loan, and that I loved them both. I sat at my desk at the endowment all afternoon, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. I genuinely expected to hear tears of relief. I expected a lengthy phone call from my mother praising my immense generosity. I fully expected my father to humbly tell me I'd saved his entire life. The long afternoon slowly turned into evening. The evening faded into night. My phone did not ring a single time. No text messages came through. No voicemails were left. Saturday morning arrived. I anxiously opened the family group chat. It was the same chat that usually pinged constantly, with Haley's daily shopping updates and my mother's continuous neighborhood complaints. The screen was completely blank. There were absolutely no new messages. I scrolled up slightly to see my own message containing the wire confirmation image. It had been marked as read by everyone in the group. I sat silently on my sofa, staring at those tiny read receipts. There was no thank you. There was absolutely no acknowledgement of the staggering fact that I had just handed them my entire life savings. There was nothing left but a cold, heavy, absolute silence. They had gotten exactly what they demanded, and the very moment my utility was exhausted, they simply turned me off like an appliance. The silence was not an oversight or a product of their relief. It was a calculated strategy. It was their precise way of maintaining the established power dynamic, ensuring I never felt like a savior, only like a subordinate who had finally paid her mandatory dues. I sat entirely alone in my apartment 24 hours after liquidating my future for them, and the devastating reality finally settled deep into my bones. I had not bought their love. I had only funded their next performance. The drive from Arlington to my hometown in Ohio takes roughly 6 hours if you do not hit construction on the turnpike. I made the grueling trip that following Sunday, exactly 4 days after I had wired my entire life savings to my father. Those were 4 days of absolute suffocating silence. I had spent the entire week meticulously convincing myself that the silence was just the byproduct of a proud man desperately digging himself out of a massive hole. I told myself Richard was simply too busy negotiating with the state tax board and securing a mechanic for his supposedly broken excavator to pick up the phone and express any gratitude. I clung to that fragile justification with both hands because the alternative was far too devastating to face while navigating highway traffic. My mother had summoned me for a mandatory Sunday dinner. She framed it as a casual family gathering, completely ignoring the fact that I had just fundamentally rescued them from financial annihilation. When I pulled into the familiar driveway, the 2-story brick house looked remarkably serene. The lawn was perfectly manicured. My father's heavy-duty truck was parked securely by the garage, looking incredibly clean and polished for a vehicle belonging to a man allegedly working around the clock to save a collapsing business. I walked up the concrete front steps carrying a decent bottle of wine I had purchased specifically to quietly celebrate his narrow escape from ruin. I pushed open the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled intensely of roasted chicken and expensive rosemary focaccia. I expected a tight hug. I expected a quiet, emotional moment in the hallway where my father might pull me aside and gruffly thank me for saving his life. Instead, my mother walked past me carrying a stack of cloth napkins. She did not stop. She simply glanced over her shoulder and told me to put my coat in the hall closet because they were eating in 10 minutes. I walked into the dining room. My sister Haley was lounging at the table, scrolling through her phone. She wore a silk blouse that looked brand new and was sipping a glass of Prosecco. My father was seated at the head of the table, looking completely relaxed, pouring himself a very generous measure of a premium aged scotch I knew cost at least $200 a bottle. He did not look like a man who had been pacing the floor, clutching his chest in agony just 4 days prior. He looked like a man on a luxury cruise. I sat down in my usual chair near the kitchen door. I waited for someone to acknowledge the massive elephant in the room. No one did. My mother brought the food out and began portioning the chicken. The conversation flowed effortlessly around me, entirely dominated by Haley. She was talking at lightning speed about fabric swatches, designer shoe fittings, and an upcoming trip she was planning. I tried to gently steer the conversation toward the reality I thought we were all sharing. I looked directly at my father and asked if the mechanic had managed to fix the hydraulic pump on his main excavator. I asked if the tax board had officially lifted the threat of an audit now that the funds were secured. The entire table went completely still. The easy-flowing atmosphere vanished in an instant. My father lowered his scotch glass and glared at me with profound irritation. He told me he had handled it. He practically barked the words, demanding to know why I would deliberately ruin a nice family dinner by bringing up stressful, dirty business talk. My mother immediately chimed in, her voice dripping with extreme disappointment. She scolded me for lacking basic social grace and asked why I always had to make things so incredibly clinical and depressing. I sat there utterly stunned. I had literally purchased the food on that table. I had purchased the roof over their heads. Yet I was being actively reprimanded for simply asking if my life savings had successfully kept my father out of federal prison. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat and looked down at my plate. The conversation immediately resumed, shifting back to Haley's busy social calendar. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with unearned arrogance, and announced that they were preparing for an incredibly exclusive trip. She bragged that our parents were taking her to an elite political gala in Washington, D.C. next month. She used words like high society and VIP access. She claimed it was an East Wing adjacent event designed strictly for federal power players and major philanthropic donors. I felt a strange prickle of genuine confusion. I work in Washington. I am the Deputy Director of the National Heritage Endowment. I personally coordinate and oversee the very federal galas she was awkwardly trying to describe. I asked her, genuinely curious, which specific organization was hosting the gala. Haley laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that completely dismissed my question. She waved her manicured hand in the air and told me not to worry my little head about it. She said it was an incredibly high-level event, far beyond the scope of the boring little administrative agency where I pushed papers. My mother smiled proudly at Haley and added that it was a highly restricted guest list. She said it was a room meant for people who actually understood how to network and influence society, not people who hid behind cubicle walls analyzing spreadsheets all day. I did not defend myself. I did not correct them. I just kept my mouth shut and focused on the quiet, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I finished my meal in silence, playing the role of the boring, invisible daughter they so desperately needed me to be. When dinner concluded, my family did what they always did. They migrated to the living room to drink wine and watch television, leaving me alone to clear the dining table and load the dishwasher. I stacked the heavy ceramic plates. I gathered the crystal wine glasses. I wiped down the long mahogany table with a damp cloth. As I moved toward this kitchen island to wipe the granite surface, I noticed Haley had left her iPad sitting dangerously close to the edge of the sink. I reached out to carefully slide it toward the center of the counter so it would not fall. As my fingers brushed the sleek metal casing, the screen suddenly woke up. A banner notification dropped down from the top of the locked screen. The text was large, bright, and impossible to ignore. The notification was an email confirmation. It read, "Your Platinum Vive IP donor package for the East Wing Gala is confirmed." I stopped breathing. The dishcloth slipped from my hand and landed softly on the granite counter. I stared at the glowing screen. A Platinum Vi IP donor package for a federal gala is not a simple ticket purchase. It is a massive, highly regulated political contribution. It is the kind of access that costs tens of thousands of dollars. My analytical brain, the part of me that untangles complex supply chains and audits federal budgets, engaged instantly. My heart rate did not speed up. In fact, it slowed down into a deep, rhythmic, terrifying calm. I tapped the notification banner. Haley was incredibly careless with her technology. She never used a complex passcode. It was simply her birth year, a code I had known since we were children. The iPad unlocked immediately, dropping me directly into her open email inbox. I did not yell. I did not run into the living room and demand an explanation. I simply stood alone in the quiet kitchen and began to read the email thread. It was a detailed billing invoice from a major political action committee based in Washington, D.C. The invoice outlined a premium access tier for 3 guests to attend an exclusive gala honoring national heritage initiatives. The package included priority seating, a private reception with congressional leaders, and a luxury hotel accommodation block. I scrolled down to the payment summary. The screen glowed harshly against my face. The total amount paid was exactly $85,000. I read the number again. $85,000 and 0 cents. It was the precise exact to the penny amount my father had sworn he needed to avoid federal prison. It was the exact amount I had frantically liquidated from my stock portfolio at 3 a.m. There was no broken hydraulic pump. There was no state tax audit. There was no imminent bankruptcy threatening the family home. My father had not used my life savings to rescue his business. He had used my entire financial safety net to buy a massive political donor package, so he, my mother, and my sister could play pretend as wealthy socialites at an elite Washington gala. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally perfect, that for a brief moment, I felt completely detached from my own physical body. I was observing a crime scene. I swiped out of the email application. I needed more data. I opened the messaging app on the iPad. I quickly located the primary family group chat. It was titled The Core 3. It included my father, my mother, and Haley. I was not in it. I had never been in it. I scrolled up to the messages sent last Tuesday, the exact night my mother had called me. weeping hysterically about my father clutching his chest in agony. The text history read like a script for a heist. My mother had written, "Tell her the state is threatening jail time. She always panics when she thinks someone is going to prison." My father had replied, "I told her I need 85. She is asking for the tax notices. She wants the balance sheets." Haley had chimed in 3 minutes later. "Just cry harder, Mom. Tell her I am too fragile to handle the stress. She hates feeling like she is not the responsible one. Just push the responsible button." I scrolled down to the messages sent on Friday morning, roughly 2 hours after my massive wire transfer had officially cleared into my father's checking account. My father wrote, "The wire hit. I am securing the platinum tier right now." My mother responded with a string of celebrating emojis. She added, "Finally. We are going to rub elbows with actual power. Make sure you book the hotel fast before the rooms sell out." Then I read the final message. It was from Haley. It was sent just yesterday. I stared at her words glowing on the screen, feeling the last remaining threads of my childhood loyalty cleanly sever and fall away. Haley had texted, "I literally cannot believe Clara's little spreadsheet money is buying my DC debut. She works so hard just to be boring. Just make sure we leave town before she figures out we are staying at the Ritz. I do not want her trying to meet up with us for cheap coffee while we are rubbing shoulders with senators. Clara's little spreadsheet money." I set the iPad down on the granite counter exactly where I had found it. I pressed the power button, plunging the screen back into darkness. I picked up the damp dishcloth and carefully wiped away the invisible smudge my finger had left on the glass. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sounds drifting in from the living room. I could hear my mother laughing at something on the television. I could hear my father cracking a joke. I could hear my sister groaning about how exhausted she was from shopping. They were perfectly at peace. They had successfully extracted my future to fund their weekend vacation, and they felt absolutely no remorse. They viewed me as nothing more than an ignorant, highly functional bank. I did not march into the living room and throw my anger in their faces. Confrontation requires a desire to be understood, and I finally realized that these people were thoroughly committed to misunderstanding me. Screaming at them would only give them the opportunity to gaslight me. They would pivot. They would claim I was violating their privacy by looking at the iPad. They would turn my discovery into my crime. I refused to give them that performance. I walked calmly into the hallway and put on my trench coat. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I stepped into the archway of the living room. They all looked up at me, their faces completely relaxed and untroubled. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told them I had a sudden logistical crisis at work that required my immediate attention. I told them I needed to drive back to Arlington tonight instead of staying over. My mother sighed heavily, looking profoundly annoyed by my lack of family commitment. She told me I worked far too much for a job that paid so little. She told me I needed to learn how to relax and enjoy life like my sister did. My father did not even look away from the television screen. He just waved a hand through the air and told me to drive safe. I walked out the front door. I walked down the concrete steps. I got into my 7-year-old sedan, and I started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway and turned onto the dark, rain-slicked road heading back to Washington, I did not shed a single tear. The grief was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, magnificent clarity. They wanted to play high society 5 IPs. They wanted to walk into the most secure elite rooms in the Capitol using my stolen money. They thought I was just a boring secretary who pushed papers across a desk. They had absolutely no idea who I really was or what kind of rooms I actually controlled. They wanted to go to Washington. I decided I was going to let them. I drove for exactly 1 hour before the questions in my mind became too loud to ignore. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets against the windshield of my sedan, washing out the red taillights of the semi-trucks ahead of me on the interstate. The heater was running full blast, but I felt entirely cold. My physical departure from my parents' driveway had been a necessary tactical retreat. I needed to remove myself from their proximity before I said something that would alert them to my discovery. But as the dark miles rolled by, my analytical brain simply would not switch off. I coordinate elite federal events for a living. I oversee the invitation lists for state dinners, philanthropy summits, and highly classified cultural galas. I know the complex architecture of Washington society intimately. I know that a Platinum 5 IP donor package is not something you can just purchase with a credit card, like a concert ticket. High-level political access requires extensive vetting. It requires comprehensive background checks, deep financial compliance reviews, and verified professional affiliations. The organizers employ rigorous screening algorithms to prevent scandals and keep problematic individuals far away from congressional leaders. My father was a failing building contractor from a small town in Ohio. His business was submerged in debt. His personal credit score was a complete disaster. He had zero history of political engagement and absolutely no philanthropic footprint. If Richard had simply submitted an online application for a Platinum Tier Access Pass along with my $85,000, the compliance software would have flagged and rejected his file within 24 hours. Wealth alone does not unlock those specific doors. You need a trusted sponsor to bypass the security gates. You need an established insider to vouch for your credibility. I pulled off the highway at the next exit and navigated toward a brightly lit chain motel sitting alone near a truck stop. I could not wait until I reached Arlington to look at the data. I parked my car under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp, walked into the lobby, and paid for a room using my personal credit card. I did not care what the room looked like. I only cared that it had a desk and a secure internet connection. I walked into the motel guest room, locked the deadbolt behind me, and set my heavy leather work tote on the small laminate desk. I pulled out my agency-issued laptop. The familiar weight of the machine grounded me. I took a slow, deliberate breath and opened the lid. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a sharp white glow across the floral bedspread. I plugged in my RSA token and typed in my complex federal login credentials. I watched the secure virtual private network establish its encrypted tunnel to the servers in Washington. As the Deputy Director of the National Heritage Endowment, I possess administrative access to the overarching federal event and donor registries. We share databases with multiple political action committees and cultural foundations to ensure compliance and track major philanthropic movements across the Capitol. I navigated directly to the Master Registry portal. The interface was a sterile gray and blue design, a system I had operated every single day for the past 6 years. My hands moved over the keyboard with practiced, effortless precision. I opened the search parameters and typed in my father's full legal name. I added his Ohio zip code to narrow the query. I pressed enter and waited for the database to process the request. A tiny blue wheel spun on the screen for 3 seconds. Then a single comprehensive file populated. I clicked on the file and expanded the view. There it was in plain black text, a fully approved Platinum 5 IP donor package for the upcoming East Wing Adjacent Cultural Gala. The primary registrant was listed as Richard. The secondary guests were Patricia and Haley. The payment status was marked as cleared in full, reflecting the exact $85,000 I had wired him the day before. But I was not interested in the payment receipt. I was searching for the compliance clearance. I needed to see exactly how a bankrupt contractor had slipped past the most stringent Social Security filters in the city. I clicked over to the Supporting Documents tab attached to his application file. There were 2 items listed. The first was a standard identification verification form. The second item was labeled as a statement of professional endorsement. I felt a strange, tight sensation grip the back of my neck. I moved my cursor over the endorsement file and double-clicked to open the PDF. The document loaded onto my screen, and the breath completely left my lungs. It was not a standard form. It was a formal letter of sponsorship, but it was the image at the top of the page that made the blood roar loudly in my ears. The letter was printed on the official highly restricted letterhead of the National Heritage Endowment. It featured the exact gold and blue seal of my federal agency perfectly centered at the top of the page. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes tracking the words paragraph by paragraph. The letter was a masterpiece of fabricated credibility. It formally introduced Richard as a vital strategic partner to the endowment. It described his failing contracting business as a premier architectural restoration firm dedicated to preserving American history. It explicitly requested that the gala organizers extend him and his family the highest level of courtesy and unrestricted VIP access, claiming that his presence was instrumental to upcoming federal initiatives. The letter was a complete absolute lie from the first syllable to the last, but the sheer magnitude of the betrayal did not hit me until I scrolled down to the very bottom of the page to read the sign-off. There, perfectly aligned above a title block, was my own name, Clara, Deputy Director of the National Heritage Endowment, and slashed across the signature line in bold black ink was my personal signature. I stared at the loops and curves of the ink. It was not a sloppy imitation. It was an incredibly precise tracing of my actual signature, likely lifted directly from one of the birthday cards I had dutifully mailed them over the years, or copied from an old tax document. My father had not just borrowed my credibility, he had stolen my identity. He had forged my name on a counterfeit government document to trick a federal security apparatus into opening a door for his own vanity. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The plastic wheels caught loudly on the cheap carpet of the motel guest room. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the rain-slicked parking lot. I had spent my entire adult life navigating the intense, grueling scrutiny required to hold a federal security clearance. I had endured exhaustive background investigations, polygraph examinations, and microscopic financial audits. I had sacrificed holidays, weekends, and personal relationships to build a reputation of absolute, unshakable integrity in a city where your reputation is your only true currency. If an ethics committee or an inspector general ever ran a routine audit on this specific gala and flagged this endorsement letter, I would be immediately suspended. My security clearance would be permanently revoked. I would be subjected to a devastating federal investigation for official misconduct, misuse of government resources, and wire fraud. The career I had built from absolutely nothing, the pristine life I had carved out of stone, would be burned to the ground overnight. I would lose my pension. I would lose my standing. I could potentially face federal indictment. And my father had risked all of that. He had placed my entire existence on the chopping block simply so that my sister Haley could wear a sequined dress, drink free champagne, and post photographs on the internet, pretending she was important. I let the curtain fall back into place. I walked back to the desk and stared at the forged signature on the screen. Up until this precise moment, I'd always viewed my family dynamic through the lens of emotional neglect. I had believed they were just deeply flawed people who were incapable of loving me properly. I had rationalized their financial demands as the desperate actions of a proud, struggling man. I had convinced myself that their cruelty was born from ignorance rather than malice. But looking at this forged document, the final lingering traces of that naive, hopeful girl completely evaporated. The grief that had been choking me for the last 4 days simply stopped. The heavy, suffocating sadness that I had carried since childhood burned away entirely, leaving nothing behind but cold, bright, actionable clarity. My father did not just take my life savings. He committed a severe federal crime. He engaged in wire fraud, identity theft, and the falsification of government documents. He had weaponized my name to bypass a sophisticated security perimeter, and he had done it with the casual, thoughtless arrogance of a man who firmly believed I existed solely to be consumed. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as a utility. They saw my clean record, my money, and my quiet disposition as raw materials they could mine for their own benefit. They truly believed I was so desperate for their validation that I would silently absorb any abuse, any theft, and any risk. They thought I would never dare to look behind the curtain, and even if I did look, they were entirely confident I would never possess the spine to do anything about it. They were expecting the quiet, accommodating Clara who always surrendered to keep the peace. They were expecting the boring little secretary who paid the bills and apologized for breathing too loudly. I reached out and gently rested my fingertips against the warm plastic casing of my laptop. I did not cry. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart beat in a steady, measured rhythm. I felt a profound, immense sense of liberation wash over me, filling the quiet space of the motel room. I carefully took a series of high-resolution screenshots of the forged endorsement letter. I downloaded the entire application packet, including the payment receipts, the time-stamped IP logs, and the specific routing data detailing exactly how my father had transmitted the fraudulent file. I saved everything into a securely encrypted folder on my local hard drive. I created a redundant backup on a secondary external drive I kept in my work tote. I treated the data with the meticulous care of a prosecutor assembling a bulletproof indictment. I closed the laptop, putting the machine to sleep. The room plunged back into darkness. My mother had told me that family takes care of family. My father had shouted that I had no right to interrogate my own blood. They had engineered a magnificent theatrical crisis to strip me of my wealth and then celebrated their victory by booking a luxury vacation under my forged name. They believed they had executed the perfect, flawless heist. But they had made one catastrophic operational error. They had assumed I was weak. I sat down on the edge of the motel bed and folded my hands perfectly in my lap. I was not going to call them and scream. I was not going to demand my money back. I was not going to warn them about the terrible danger they had just put themselves in. Warning them would give them time to panic, time to formulate excuses, and time to spin a new narrative of victimhood. Instead, I was going to let them put on their expensive, tailored clothes. I was going to let them pack their designer luggage and board a comfortable flight to Washington. I was going to let them walk right up to the velvet ropes of the highest society they could possibly imagine. I would allow them to firmly believe they had won right up until the very final second. I laid back against the stiff motel pillows and stared up at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow, I would drive the rest of the way back to Arlington. I would walk into my corner office overlooking the Capitol, and I would begin the precise, methodical work of turning their glamorous stolen vacation into a federal trap. The drive back to Washington took 7 hours, but for the first time in my life, I did not spend a single minute of that journey worrying about how my family was feeling. The frantic, suffocating guilt that had dictated my every move since childhood was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, brilliant clarity. As I crossed the bridge into the district, watching the monumental architecture of the Capitol rise against the slate-gray sky, I felt the final heavy layers of the compliant, invisible daughter I knew fall away. I was no longer the convenient bank of Richard and Patricia. I was a federal executive holding the exact coordinates of a crime, and I knew precisely how to map the fallout. I did not go home to my apartment. I bypassed my neighborhood entirely and navigated straight toward a sleek glass building on K Street. I did not need a therapist to process my feelings, and I certainly did not need a family mediator to facilitate a conversation. I needed a shark. Her name was Vivian, and she was a senior partner at a boutique law firm specializing in white-collar defense and corporate fraud. She was entirely out of my usual tax bracket, a woman who billed by the minute and routinely dismantled fraudulent executives before they even realized they were bleeding. We had crossed paths a year prior when she was managing a complex philanthropic trust that fell under the jurisdiction of my agency. I remembered her absolute terrifying competence. She did not deal in emotions. She dealt in paper and timelines and in the brutal arithmetic of the law. I sat across from her in a polished conference room that smelled of expensive leather and black coffee. I did not waste her time with a tearful preamble about my childhood or my sister's insufferable arrogance. I simply opened my heavy leather tote and placed the encrypted backup drive on the pristine mahogany table. Next to it, I laid out the physical copies I had printed at the motel, the $85,000 wire transfer confirmation, the email receipt for the Platinum 5 IP donor package, and finally the masterpiece of my father's deception, the forged corporate sponsorship letter bearing the stolen seal of the National Heritage Endowment and my perfectly traced signature. Vivian put on a pair of silver wire-framed glasses and began to read. She did not speak. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp turn of paper and the low hum of the city traffic outside her floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the pages, dissecting the precise mechanism of my father's arrogance. I could see her prosecutorial brain categorizing the evidence, moving it from a domestic grievance into the strict, rigid columns of the federal penal code. When she finally finished, she neatly squared the edges of the paper stack, took off her glasses, and looked at me with a gaze so intensely serious, it made the air in the room feel thin. She told me my father had fundamentally miscalculated the universe he was playing in. She broke it down with chilling precision. This was not a simple case of a parent borrowing money under false pretenses. By utilizing my stolen identity and slapping a counterfeit federal seal onto a document to secure political access, Richard had crossed a massive, uncrossable line. Vivian listed the charges as if reading from a menu. Wire fraud, which carried a staggering penalty because he transported the stolen funds across state lines. Identity theft aggravated by the fact that it was used to secure an elite financial package, and the absolute death blow falsifying a government document and impersonating a federal official. She leaned forward, pressing her manicured hands flat against the table. She told me Richard was not looking at a fine or a slap on the wrist. She said he was facing a catastrophic federal indictment and substantial prison time. The $85,000 he stole from my stock portfolio was nothing compared to the legal avalanche he had just casually triggered. Vivian reached for the sleek black phone sitting on the corner of her desk. She did not ask a question. She stated her intention. She offered to call her direct contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. She wanted to freeze his account, secure a warrant, and have federal agents knocking on his front door in Ohio before dinner. It would be fast, brutal, and entirely justified. She held the receiver in her hand, waiting for my final confirmation. I looked at the phone. I looked at the undeniable proof of my family's betrayal sitting under the bright conference room lights. The temptation to let the hammer fall right then and there was immense. But the strategic operational side of my brain, the part that meticulously orchestrates events involving heads of state, saw the immediate flaw in that plan. I reached across the mahogany table and gently placed my hand over the phone, pressing the receiver back into its cradle. I told Vivian no. She looked at me, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. She warned me that delaying the report could complicate the asset recovery. She cautioned that hesitant victims often lose their leverage. I pulled my hand back and explained the specific twisted architecture of my family. I told her that if Richard was arrested in his own driveway in Ohio, he would instantly become a martyr. My mother would immediately activate the church prayer chain. She would spin a masterfully tragic narrative about a struggling, hardworking father who made a tiny, desperate mistake trying to save his business, only to be ruthlessly destroyed by his wealthy, vindictive, estranged daughter. The entire town would rally around them. Haley would post tearful videos claiming I had ruined their lives out of sheer, unadulterated jealousy. They would rewrite the history of the fraud until they were the victims, and I was the monster who broke the family over a simple misunderstanding. I refused to let them own the narrative. I refused to let my mother edit this story into a tragedy where they got to play the innocent casualties. I looked Vivian directly in the eye and delivered the strategy that had solidified in my mind somewhere around 2 a.m. on a rain-slicked highway. I told her that if I struck now, my mother would spin a narrative that I ruined the family out of jealousy. They want to play high society peas. I said, my voice completely devoid of any tremor. Let them walk right up to the federal security gates with forged credentials. Vivian studied my face for a long, silent moment. She possessed the razor-sharp instincts of a woman who had spent decades watching powerful people engineer their own destruction. Slowly, a small, terrifyingly professional smile spread across her face. She understood the assignment perfectly. She leaned back in her leather chair and agreed to hold the legal filings in a secured vault, ready to launch the civil asset recovery, the very second the criminal dominoes began to fall in Washington. We established our timeline. We shook hands. I left her office feeling like an architect who had just reviewed the blueprints for a flawless demolition. The next morning, I walked into the headquarters of the National Heritage Endowment. The building is a fortress of limestone and glass, protected by layers of security that the average citizen never even perceives. I badged through the outer perimeter, past the armed guards in the lobby, and rode the elevator up to the executive floor. My office was waiting for me, perfectly ordered, smelling of polished wood and fresh coffee. I did not sit at my desk to check emails. I walked straight down the executive corridor to the secured suite belonging to our internal security and compliance division. The head of our security liaison team was a man named David, a former Secret Service agent who handled the threat assessments and perimeter protocols for all our high-profile galas. David did not tolerate anomalies, and he possessed a deep institutional paranoia that made him brilliant at his job. I knocked once on his heavy glass door and stepped inside. He looked up from a bank of monitors, offering a brief, respectful nod. He asked how the preparations for the East Wing event were proceeding. I closed the door behind me, ensuring it latched completely. I sat down in the chair opposite his desk and handed him a sealed, classified routing folder. I told him we had a critical security breach in the VIP donor registry. David's entire demeanor shifted instantly from casual colleague to active federal agent. He opened the folder. Inside was the complete packet I had downloaded at the motel, the forged sponsorship letter, the IP routing data, the payment confirmation. I explained the situation with clinical emotional detachment. I stated that an unauthorized party had fabricated an official agency endorsement to bypass the background algorithms and secure a platinum tier entry pass. I omitted the fact that the perpetrators were my own parents and sister. In this room, in this building, they were simply an external threat vector that had compromised a federal system. David scrutinized the forged seal on the document. His jaw tightened. He asked if the individuals were already in the capital or if they were traveling. I informed him they were scheduled to arrive the day before the gala and had booked rooms at the Ritz-Carlton. He reached for his secure terminal and began typing with rapid, forceful keystrokes. He did not ask if I wanted to handle it quietly. In his world, a forged federal credential attempting to access a room filled with congressional leaders and foreign diplomats was a level 1 security crisis. I sat quietly and watched him work. He was logging the fraudulent package directly into the master matrix shared by the Secret Service and the Capitol Police. He flagged the specific confirmation numbers associated with Richard's ticket. He attached the forged endorsement letter to the digital alert, ensuring that the moment those specific passes were scanned at any security perimeter, the system would immediately flash red. He looked up from the glowing monitors, his face set in hard lines. He confirmed that the trap was locked into the database. He assured me that the moment they attempted to cross the security threshold, they would be immediately intercepted and detained for questioning by federal agents. He asked if I needed an armed escort or any personal protection detail, given that my identity had been utilized in the breach. I politely declined the protection detail. I told him I would be personally overseeing the primary entry checkpoint on the night of the gala anyway, as it fell under my standard operational duties. I assured him I simply wanted the protocol to function exactly as designed. I thanked David for his rapid response and walked back to my corner office. I closed the heavy oak door and stood by the massive window looking out over the sprawling, powerful grid of the city. My father believed he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had easily outmaneuvered the boring daughter who spent her life typing on a keyboard. He was profoundly confident that his stolen $85,000 was going to purchase him a seat at a table of untouchable elites. He assumed Washington was just a larger version of his small Ohio town, a place where a loud voice and a fake smile could bulldoze through any barrier. He did not realize that the perimeter he was preparing to breach was not governed by smiling hostesses or polite charity workers. It was governed by federal agents with earpieces, biometric scanners, and a strict, unyielding mandate to protect the room from frauds exactly like him. The mechanism was now fully active. It required absolutely no further intervention from me. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for my money back. I simply had to wait for the calendar to turn. I sat down at my desk, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and opened my quarterly projections. For the first time in 33 years, I felt absolutely no obligation to save them from themselves. The long silent countdown to the gala had officially begun. The passage of time takes on a completely different texture when you are no longer waiting for someone to love you. The weeks leading up to the gala moved with a strange and brilliant grace. I returned to my apartment in Arlington and resumed my daily routine, but the suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire adult life was entirely gone. I was no longer the anxious daughter, desperately trying to balance my family's manufactured crises. I was an executive watching a clock tick down to an inevitable conclusion. My mother continued to send her usual barrage of text messages. She complained about the rising cost of groceries. She sent lengthy, unprompted updates about the neighborhood gossip in Ohio. I responded to every single message with the exact level of boring, predictable compliance she expected. I sent generic smiley faces. I typed out bland sympathies regarding her minor inconveniences. I played the role of Clara the gray cardigan wearing secretary flawlessly. It is remarkably easy to perform a role once the emotional stakes have been permanently removed. When you finally stop hoping that the people on the other end of the phone will suddenly wake up and recognize your inherent worth. Their manipulation stops feeling like a personal wound. It simply becomes a highly predictable script. I knew their lines before they even typed them. I knew when my father would ignore a question. I knew when my sister would drop a subtle insult disguised as a joke. I simply watched the words appear on my screen and felt absolutely nothing at all. The crowning moment of their performance arrived precisely 2.5 weeks before the gala was scheduled to take place. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. My phone lit up with a video call request from my parents. I accepted the call, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of iced water. Richard and Patricia were sitting side by side on their living room sofa in Ohio. They looked tanned, rested, and incredibly relaxed. Patricia took the immediate lead, her voice dripping with that manufactured sugary sweetness she specifically utilizes when she is about to deliver a profound slight. She announced with wide eyes that they had decided to take a spontaneous private family vacation to Washington, D.C. She dramatically placed her hand over her chest and claimed that the recent business stress had simply been too much for my poor father to bear. She insisted they desperately needed a change of scenery to recuperate. I watched their faces on my small digital screen. I did not ask how a man facing imminent federal prison and total bankruptcy was suddenly affording a spontaneous vacation to one of the most expensive cities in the country. I simply smiled my most polite professional smile and told them that a vacation sounded like a lovely idea. Then came the orchestrated pivot. Patricia leaned closer to the camera and sighed heavily. She looked at me with an expression of practiced, completely fake regret. She told me that, unfortunately, their schedule was going to be incredibly tight during their visit. She claimed they had booked a highly structured tour of historical monuments and were attending several very exclusive private dinners. She frowned slightly and said they probably would not have any time to see me at all while they were in my city. She quickly justified the exclusion by insisting the trip was really more of a restorative journey for Haley. She claimed Haley's delicate creative spirit had been so deeply damaged by the recent family trauma that they needed to focus their entire trip completely on her mental well-being. My father chimed in right on cue. He crossed his arms and gruffly added that I worked far too much anyway. He said he did not want to disrupt my boring little office routine with their fast-paced vacation. He casually dismissed my entire existence with a wave of his hand telling me to just keep my head down and focus on filing my paperwork. The sheer breathtaking audacity of their lie was almost magnificent to witness. They were traveling to my city entirely funded by my stolen life savings to attend a high society gala using my forged signature, and they were actively, preemptively banning me from seeing them so I would not accidentally discover their massive theft. I did not blink. I told them I completely understood how busy vacations could be. I told them to have a wonderful time and to travel safely. I hung up the phone, set it face down on the table, and felt a genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. 2 days later, the audacity escalated even further. My phone vibrated with a long text message from Haley. It was not a greeting or a friendly check-in. It was an invoice. She wrote that she was in the middle of a massive shopping emergency for their upcoming DC trip. She claimed she had found the absolute perfect designer gown for a very important dinner they were attending, but she was suddenly short on cash because she had generously paid for her own flight to help out our parents. She explicitly asked me to transfer $2,000 to her account immediately, so she would not miss out on the dress. I sat at my desk and stared at her message. She was actually asking the sister she had mocked for having little spreadsheet money to purchase the gown she planned to wear while parading around on my stolen funds. I did not reply. I did not type out a lecture on financial responsibility. I did not send a single punctuation mark. I just let the text sit there unread and unanswered, suspended forever in the digital void. The power of simply doing nothing is a tool most people never learn to use. While my family was busy packing their designer luggage in Ohio, completely convinced they had successfully outsmarted the entire world, my actual life in Washington was operating at a completely different altitude. The irony of my daily routine was so incredibly thick, it was almost a physical object in the room with me. I was not pushing paper in a cubicle. I was the chief architect of the very room they were currently plotting to sneak into. The East Wing Gala was the absolute crown jewel of our fiscal year. It required a massive complex synchronization of federal agencies, private security contractors, and White House protocol staff. My days were spent in secure, windowless briefing rooms, deep within the endowment building, surrounded by men and women wearing earpieces and tactical lapel pins. We reviewed the spatial layouts of the venue with surgical military precision. I sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table, projecting the venue floor plans onto a massive digital screen. I was the person who ultimately decided where every single senator, every foreign diplomat, and every major philanthropic donor would be seated for the evening. I knew exactly which tables were closest to the main podium. I knew which sightlines were optimal for the press pool. I dictated which restricted entry points would be utilized by the heavily guarded motorcades. I approved the floral arrangements, managing a decorative budget that cost more than the house I grew up in, while completely ignoring my sister's frantic texts begging for a $2,000 dress. My team and I went over the security protocols line by tedious line. The lead Secret Service liaison presented the biometric screening procedures for the event. Every single guest holding a Platinum 5 IP pass was required to pass through a multi-layered hardened checkpoint. Their physical credentials would be scanned, cross-referenced against the federal master database, and verified by facial recognition software before they were ever allowed to step foot onto the red carpet. The security perimeter was designed to be absolute and entirely unforgiving. I listened to the security briefings with total professional detachment. I approved the deployment of secondary screening teams. I authorized the strict contingency plans for any unauthorized access attempts. I established the exact holding protocols for individuals flagged with fraudulent documentation. I held the entire operational blueprint of that night in my hands. When I returned to my corner office, I would occasionally glance at my phone to see another passive-aggressive text from my mother, complaining about how difficult it was to find good travel accessories in her small town. She would send pictures of expensive leather travel bags, dropping heavy hints that a good daughter might offer to purchase them for her trip. I simply archived the messages and returned to my work. The contrast between her mundane lies and my actual reality was staggering. They truly thought they were playing a grand, sophisticated game of chess. They believed they were the brilliant masterminds of a high society infiltration. They pictured themselves gliding effortlessly through the velvet ropes, flashing their expensive smiles, and instantly belonging to a world of wealth and influence. They had absolutely no idea they were simply walking into a highly calibrated machine that I had personally helped construct. They had no idea that the federal security gates they were so eager to approach were manned by highly trained professionals who reported directly to the very daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like an invisible afterthought. They believed I was sitting in my apartment in Arlington, wearing gray wool and eating leftover soup entirely unaware of their glamorous ascension. I finalized the elite seating charts. I signed off on the final perimeter defense budgets. I confirmed the holding room locations with the primary security liaisons. I securely locked my computer for the evening. I went home to my quiet, pristine apartment, drank my hot tea, and patiently waited for my family to arrive in my city. Washington on a Friday evening carries a very specific kind of atmospheric pressure. It is a city that runs entirely on access, a place where the proximity to power is treated as a tangible currency. If you know how to read the subtle indicators, you can tell exactly who belongs in the inner circles and who is merely pressing their face against the glass. I stood in the sprawling, opulent lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, a building that practically vibrated with the hushed, urgent conversations of lobbyists, diplomats, and political operatives. The air smelled of expensive cedar, fresh-cut lilies, and old money. The floors were polished marble that reflected the glow of massive tiered crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceilings. It was a space designed specifically to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. I was not wearing a designer evening gown. I was wearing my sensible beige trench coat over a dark tailored work skirt and flat shoes. My hair was pulled back into a simple, practical knot. I looked exactly like the mid-level administrative worker my family firmly believed I was. I blended perfectly into the background, just another weary local grabbing a coffee after a long shift, completely invisible to the wealthy travelers bustling past the velvet ropes of the concierge desk. But I was not invisible, and I was not there by accident. I was standing in that lobby because I needed to administer one final silent test. When you uncover a betrayal so profound that it permanently alters the foundation of your reality, your brain demands a certain level of absolute verification before it allows you to initiate the point of no return. I had the forged corporate sponsorship letter securely locked in my agency office. I had the digital IP routing data confirming my father committed federal wire fraud. I had the Secret Service database alerts primed and waiting at the security gates of the National Heritage Endowment Gala. The trap was meticulously set, entirely fully functional, and completely out of my hands. Yet a small, stubborn fragment of my childhood conditioning was still clinging to a desperate, irrational hope. I needed to look my father in the eye one last time. I needed to offer them a single fragile olive branch. I had to know beyond a shadow of a legal or moral doubt that they were completely beyond redemption. If there was even a fraction of guilt in my father's eyes, if my mother showed even a solitary ounce of genuine remorse, or if they simply looked happy to see their daughter in the city they were visiting, I might have found a way to stop the federal gears from crushing them. I needed them to hand me the final shovel so I could bury my guilt forever. I waited near a massive stone pillar by the primary elevator banks. The digital numbers above the brass doors illuminated counting down as the carriages descended from the premium luxury suites on the upper floors. I knew exactly which suite they were staying in because I had read the confirmation email they purchased with my stolen life savings. The brass doors parted with a soft melodic chime. My family stepped out into the lobby, and the sheer breathtaking audacity of their visual transformation almost knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. Richard, the struggling, allegedly bankrupt contractor from a dying Ohio town, stepped onto the marble floor wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. The fabric caught the chandelier light with the unmistakable sheen of high-end imported wool. The cut of the jacket fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a garment that had clearly required expedited, expensive alterations. He adjusted his silk cuffs with a heavy gold-plated watch gleaming on his wrist. He did not look like a man who had been pacing the floor, clutching his chest in financial agony just 3 weeks prior. He looked like a billionaire patron of the arts. He carried himself with a stiff, unearned arrogance, his chin tilted upward as he surveyed the lobby, expecting the world to naturally part and make way for his arrival. Patricia walked right beside him. My mother, who had wept hysterically through the phone about losing the family dining table to the bank, was draped in a floor-length emerald silk gown. Her hair had been professionally styled into an elaborate, elegant sweep. Around her neck rested a thick, sparkling collar of diamonds, or very high-quality crystals that she certainly did not own a month ago. She held a small, structured designer clutch in her hands, her posture rigid with the desperate, vibrating energy of a woman determined to prove she belonged in a social stratum she fundamentally did not understand. Haley trailed slightly behind them, practically glowing with toxic, narcissistic excitement. She wore a backless sequined dress that plunged dangerously low, a garment engineered entirely for the camera flashes of the press pool. She was holding her phone up continuously, recording short video clips of the hotel architecture, documenting her glamorous ascent into high society for an audience of strangers on the internet. They looked incredible. They looked wealthy, polished, and completely untouchable. And every single thread of silk, every facet of jewelry, and every night spent in that luxury hotel had been directly financed by the $85,000 I had liquidated in the middle of the night to save them from a fabricated disaster. They were wearing my stolen future, and they wore it with absolute staggering pride. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, conditioned air of the lobby fill my chest. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands were perfectly steady. I stepped out from behind the heavy stone pillar and walked directly into their path. I stopped roughly 5 feet in front of them, blocking their route to the main revolving doors. "Hello, Dad." "Hello, Mom." The physical reaction was immediate and entirely revealing. They did not gasp in pleasant surprise. They did not reach out to pull me into a warm family embrace. They stopped dead in their tracks, and a wave of profound, unfiltered annoyance crashed over all 3 of their faces simultaneously. My father's confident, aristocratic posture instantly evaporated, replaced by the irritated glare of a man whose pleasant evening had just been rudely interrupted by a beggar. My mother visibly recoiled her hand, gripping her expensive clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Haley actually groaned out loud, aggressively rolling her eyes and instantly lowering her phone so my pedestrian image would not contaminate her social media feed. "What are you doing here, Clara?" my mother demanded. Her tone was sharp, brittle, and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. She looked rapidly around the lobby, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy patrons nearby, absolutely terrified that someone important might witness her speaking to a woman in a cheap beige trench coat. I ignored the hostility. I kept my expression perfectly mild, playing the role of the incredibly dense, forgiving daughter to the absolute limit. "I saw on social media that you were in town," I said, keeping my voice soft and accommodating. "I know you said your schedule was packed, but I thought maybe you could spare an hour. I was hoping we could get a quick dinner. Just the 4 of us. Somewhere casual before your big event tonight." It was the olive branch. It was a genuine offer of connection, a simple request to break bread with my own flesh and blood in the city I called home. Richard stepped forward, physically placing himself between me and the rest of the lobby. He looked me up and down, his eyes performing a slow, degrading sweep from the collar of my practical coat down to the toes of my sensible leather flats. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if I were a piece of trash that had blown in through the front doors and stuck to his expensive leather shoes. "Clara, we are networking with important people tonight," he said, his voice dropping into a harsh, condescending whisper meant to inflict maximum humiliation. "Senators? Don't make this awkward. Go back to your little apartment." He delivered the words with the casual, brutal efficiency of a man swatting away an insect. There was no guilt in his eyes. There was no secret shame vibrating behind his aggressive posture. He looked at the daughter whose life savings he had stolen, whose federal career he had actively jeopardized, and he felt nothing but profound irritation that she was ruining his aesthetic vibe. I did not flinch. I let his words hang in the air between us, letting the sheer magnificent cruelty of the rejection settle into the marble floor. Patricia stepped up beside him, adjusting her emerald silk shawl. She offered me a pitying, tight-lipped smile that was somehow worse than my father's overt aggression. She sighed a long theatrical sound of supreme exhaustion. "You just wouldn't fit in with this crowd, honey," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She reached out and lightly, condescendingly patted the sleeve of my trench coat. "It's a blood-only event anyway." A blood-only event. The phrase was so incredibly bizarre, so violently elitist, and completely disconnected from the reality of how federal political galas actually operate, that it perfectly encapsulated the profound depth of their delusion. She was trying to deploy the language of aristocracy, attempting to politely inform me that I lacked the proper pedigree to walk in their exalted circles. She was entirely oblivious to the monumental irony that the only reason she was standing in that hotel lobby was because she was standing on my broken back. Haley scoffed loudly from behind them. She did not even bother to look at me. She simply tapped her father on the shoulder of his custom tuxedo. "We need to go," she complained, her voice whining with impatience. The black car is waiting outside, and I absolutely refuse to be late for the red carpet arrivals. Richard did not say goodbye. Patricia did not offer a parting glance. They simply stepped around me, physically navigating their bodies to avoid brushing against my coat, and walked purposefully toward the grand revolving doors of the hotel entrance. I stood perfectly still on the polished marble and watched them leave. I watched my father hand a folded tip to the doorman. I watched them slide into the back of a massive, gleaming black luxury SUV that had been idling at the curb. I watched the taillights flare red as the vehicle merged smoothly into the heavy Friday evening traffic, carrying them away toward the glittering heart of the Capitol. They had left me standing completely alone in the lobby. I turned around and began to walk toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp, biting cold of the Washington night. The city air hit my face, smelling of damp concrete and exhaust fumes, and I took a massive, shuddering breath. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. The heavy, dark, parasitic burden of hope that I had carried in my chest for 33 years was finally completely dead. My father had not just rejected a dinner invitation. He had looked me directly in the eye and confirmed that my absolute only value to him was the money he could extract from my accounts. My mother had looked at my sensible clothes and confirmed that I was an embarrassment to her fabricated social standing. They had actively stolen my life, and their only regret was that I had shown up to remind them of the theft. The final test was over, and they had failed it with spectacular, devastating perfection. I walked down the busy sidewalk, moving past the tourists and the power brokers, feeling an intense, radiant heat blooming in the center of my chest. It was the heat of absolute, pure emancipation. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my trench coat. I opened my encrypted messaging application and navigated to the secure channel connecting directly to David, the head of the security liaison team at the National Heritage Endowment. The gala was scheduled to begin its primary intake procedures in exactly 45 minutes. The red carpet would be swarming with congressional leaders, cabinet members, and the elite donor class. The security checkpoints would be fully operational, heavily manned by Secret Service agents and federal compliance officers, scanning every single credential that crossed the threshold. I typed a very brief, highly specific message into the secure channel. "The targets are in transit," I wrote. "They are traveling in a black luxury SUV. They will be presenting the flagged platinum VIP credentials at the primary East Wing entry gate. Do not deviate from the established protocol. Execute the perimeter breach response exactly as authorized." I hit send. I watched the tiny encrypted checkmark appear on the screen, confirming the message had been securely delivered and read by the command center. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I wrapped my practical beige trench coat a little tighter around my shoulders against the biting wind. I did not hail a cab to follow them. I did not need to be in the room to watch the explosion. I already knew exactly how the architecture of the trap functioned because I was the one who had built it. I began the long, quiet walk back toward the metro station, feeling the firm, solid concrete beneath my sensible shoes. My conscience was entirely, gloriously clean. The villains of my story had dressed themselves in stolen silk and marched willingly toward their own destruction, completely blind to the fact that the boring, invisible daughter they had left behind in the lobby was the absolute master of the house they were trying to break into. The air inside a federal gala hours before the doors open possesses a very distinct electrified hum. It is the sound of absolute power preparing to put on a spectacular show. Walking through the sprawling neoclassical atrium of our Grand Museum venue that Saturday evening, I felt the familiar grounding weight of my own authority settle perfectly over my shoulders. The space was entirely unrecognizable from its daytime state. Towering pillars of white marble were bathed in soft amber uplighting, casting long dramatic shadows across the polished terrazzo floors. A literal army of production staff caterers and private security contractors moved around me in a synchronized high-speed ballet, and every single one of them was operating entirely on my schedule. I wore a tailored, sharp black evening suit that cost more than my father had ever made in a single month of honest labor. A discreet, coiled, clear acoustic tube ran up the back of my neck and nestled securely into my right ear, connecting me directly to the encrypted communication channel shared by the event producers and the federal security details. I carried a sleek, leather portfolio holding the Master Manifest. That simple binder was the ultimate gatekeeper of the evening. It contained the exact seating assignments, the dietary restrictions, and the absolute security clearances for a room that would shortly hold 400 of the most influential human beings on the planet. I moved down the length of the plush crimson carpet that had just been unrolled across the grand entrance. My stride was measured, unhurried, and completely commanding. I was no longer the shrinking, compliant girl who had endured decades of emotional extortion in a dreary Ohio dining room. I was the deputy director of the National Heritage Endowment, and I was exactly where I was meant to be. A senior production manager jogged up to me, holding a digital tablet, nervously asking for final approval on the ambient acoustic levels for the string quartet, positioned on the mezzanine. I listened to the sweeping notes of a cello drifting down from the balcony, analyzing the reverberation against the stone walls. I instructed him to drop the master volume by precisely 12% to ensure the background music would not drown out the hushed, critical political negotiations that would inevitably occur over the caviar appetizers. He nodded, instantly relieved to have a definitive answer, and hurried away to relay my exact orders to the sound engineers. I continued my perimeter check, my eyes catching every microscopic detail. I signaled to a lighting technician to adjust a spotlight that was hitting a historical portrait at too harsh of an angle. I authorized the catering director to begin chilling the reserve champagne for the VIP holding rooms. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the lead bomb-sniffing K-9 unit handlers as they completed their final exhaustive sweep of the coat check and the primary cloakrooms. When you orchestrate events for billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and members of the presidential cabinet, there is absolutely zero margin for error. Every variable is controlled. Every potential crisis is anticipated and neutralized before it can ever manifest. As I watched two heavily armed tactical agents secure the rear loading dock, the sheer staggering irony of the situation washed over me. My family was currently getting dressed in a luxury hotel suite paid for by my stolen savings. My sister was undoubtedly posing in her expensive sequined gown, completely convinced she was about to make a glamorous debut into high society. My father was likely adjusting his custom tuxedo, brimming with the toxic, unearned confidence of a man who believed his fabricated corporate sponsorship letter had successfully outsmarted the federal government. They thought they were sneaking into an exclusive castle. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the keys to the drawbridge. They thought they had left me behind a boring administrative failure, crying in her cheap apartment. Instead, I was the undisputed architect of the very room they were so desperately trying to infiltrate. My earpiece crackled with a burst of static, followed by the crisp, authoritative voice of the lead security liaison positioned at the outer perimeter. He announced that the local Metropolitan Police had officially closed down the surrounding avenues and established the secure motorcade routes. The event was shifting from preparation into active execution. The great machine was turning on. I pressed the small transmission button hidden on the lapel of my blazer and acknowledged the update. I instructed the outer perimeter teams to hold their positions and wait for my final verbal authorization before opening the initial security gates. I needed to have one final critical conversation before the first guests began to arrive. I turned away from the grand entrance and walked briskly down a quiet, secured corridor leading to the temporary command center, established in a heavily guarded conference room. 2 Secret Service agents, standing watch outside the door, recognized me instantly, offering respectful nods as they stepped aside to grant me access. I opened the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the room. It was brightly lit, lined with temporary communication hubs and banks of glowing monitors, displaying live feeds from every security camera inside and outside the venue. Sitting at the head of the central table was Sarah. She was the head of White House protocol, a woman possessing an intellect so incredibly sharp it could cut glass. Sarah was a legendary figure in Washington, a master political strategist who had spent the last 2 decades flawlessly managing the delicate, treacherous egos of global leaders. She wore a severe, immaculate white pantsuit and projected an aura of absolute terrifying competence. We had worked together on a dozen high-stakes summits, and we shared a deep, mutual understanding built on mutual respect and shared exhaustion. Sarah looked up from a stack of security briefings as I approached the table. She offered a warm, genuine smile that she reserved strictly for the very few people she actually trusted. She asked me how the floor looked, her eyes studying my face for any signs of operational stress. I sat down in the leather chair beside her and placed my master portfolio flat on the table. I told her the floor was perfect, the lighting was balanced, and the catering staff was fully prepped for the first wave of arrivals. She nodded, taking a sip from a porcelain coffee cup. She remarked that this particular gala had drawn a remarkably high concentration of senior cabinet members, making the perimeter defense even more critical than usual. She tapped her manicured fingernail against a thick stack of printed background checks. She noted that her team had already spent the entire week running exhaustive microscopic audits on every single corporate sponsor and high-tier donor on the guest list. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. The time for quiet observation had passed. It was time to lock the final mechanism of the trap into place. I kept my voice incredibly steady, completely devoid of any personal emotion or familial grief. I spoke to her not as a wounded daughter, but as a fellow federal executive coordinating a complex security operation. I told Sarah that I needed to flag a specific incoming party for an immediate hard interception at the primary East Wing entry gate. Sarah stopped moving. Her coffee cup halted halfway to her mouth. The relaxed collegiate atmosphere in the command center evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp professional tension. She slowly lowered the cup back to its saucer and looked directly into my eyes. She did not ask if I was sure. She did not question my judgment. In our world, an executive does not flag a party for a hard interception unless they possess absolute, irrefutable proof of a severe security breach. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers together. She asked for the details, her voice dropping into a low, serious register. I opened my portfolio and extracted a thin, unmarked manila folder I had prepared specifically for this meeting. I slid the folder across the polished table. Sarah opened it. Inside was a clean, high-resolution copy of the forged sponsorship document my father had submitted to the event organizers. The counterfeit gold and blue seal of the National Heritage Endowment gleamed under the conference room lights. Below the fabricated text praising Richard's non-existent architectural restoration firm was the perfect stolen tracing of my own signature. I watched Sarah read the document. Her eyes narrowed as she absorbed the sheer audacity of the fabrication. I explained the situation with clinical, devastating precision. I stated that an unauthorized external entity had systematically falsified a government endorsement in order to bypass our mandatory philanthropic background checks. I detailed how they had utilized a fraudulent corporate identity to purchase $5 and a platinum VIP donor package, attempting to secure unrestricted physical access to a room filled with highly vulnerable political targets. I concluded by stating that the signature authorizing the endorsement was a complete forgery executed without my knowledge or consent. Sarah did not gasp. She did not express theatrical outrage. She simply stared at the forged document with the cold, calculating fury of a woman who dedicated her entire life to protecting the integrity of federal institutions. She understood the gravity of the crime immediately. This was not a minor ticketing error. This was a deliberate, sophisticated attempt to breach a secure federal perimeter using stolen credentials. It was wire fraud, identity theft, and a direct threat to the safety of the event. She looked up from the folder, her expression hardening into absolute stone. She asked if the Secret Service liaison team had already been briefed on the breach. I confirmed that David had logged the fraudulent confirmation numbers directly into the master matrix the previous morning. I explained that the system was primed to flash a red alert the instant those specific passes were scanned at any entry point. Sarah closed the folder and rested her hand flat on top of it. She nodded slowly, completely comprehending the tactical layout. She asked me how I wanted the interception handled when the targets inevitably arrived at the velvet ropes. This was the crucial moment. I could have asked for them to be quietly pulled aside into a discreet holding room to avoid a scene. I could have requested that the agents simply turn them away with a polite explanation regarding a paperwork error. I could have chosen to protect them from the crushing humiliation they so richly deserved. But I thought about my father sneering at my beige trench coat in the hotel lobby, telling me to go back to my little apartment. I thought about my mother claiming I lacked the proper pedigree to fit in with an elite, blood-only crowd. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance that had allowed them to steal my future and forge my name without a single second of hesitation. I looked at Sarah, my face perfectly calm, my voice entirely devoid of pity. I told her I wanted the protocol executed exactly by the book. No special treatment, no quiet deferrals. I wanted them stopped at the primary security checkpoint in full view of the arriving guests. I wanted the agents to treat the forged credentials with the exact level of severe, uncompromising federal authority that a breach of this magnitude legally required. Let them experience the absolute reality of the gates they tried to crash, I said. Sarah held my gaze for a long moment. A silent, profound understanding passed between us. She recognized that this was not merely a logistical security issue. She recognized that there was a deeper, unsaid justice being served in this room. She did not ask for the names of the perpetrators, and I did not offer them. She simply nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement that sealed their fate. She picked up her secure radio, pressing the transmission button to connect directly with the outer perimeter command teams. Her voice was brisk, commanding, and entirely ruthless. She instructed all primary checkpoint units to be on maximum high alert for a flagged party attempting to enter under a fraudulent Platinum 5 FIEP package. She ordered the agents to execute an immediate hard stop upon contact, confiscate the forged credentials, and detain the individuals for questioning regarding suspected federal wire fraud. I listened to her relay the orders, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settle into my bones. The mechanism was now completely locked. The trap was armed, and the trigger was entirely out of my hands. My family had spent my entire life teaching me that actions have consequences. Tonight, they were finally going to learn what happens when you apply that lesson to the very person you chronically underestimated. I thanked Sarah for her swift coordination. I stood up, retrieved my master portfolio, and smoothed the jacket of my evening suit. I walked out of the secure command center and moved back down the long corridor toward the grand entrance of the museum. The string quartet was now playing a vibrant, soaring melody that echoed through the magnificent marble halls. The ambient lighting was perfect. The catering teams were standing at attention. The room was breathtaking, a masterpiece of power, wealth, and flawless organization. I walked to the top of the grand sweeping staircase overlooking the primary security checkpoint. The heavy glass doors were being unlocked. The red carpet stretched out into the crisp Washington night, waiting for the arrival of the elite. I stood there in the amber light, holding my clipboard, completely comfortable in my own skin, and I waited for the monsters of my childhood to walk directly into the jaws of the federal government. It was going to be a spectacular evening. If you have ever had to quietly dismantle someone's arrogance from behind the scenes, if you know the power of letting a cruel person walk into a trap they built themselves, leave a comment below. Your stories matter. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to hear exactly how this beautiful disaster ends. Time in Arlington is 9:15 p.m. I will see you in the next part. Washington operates on a frequency that most people never truly hear. It is a low, constant vibration of influence, a language spoken entirely in quiet nods, discreet handshakes, and the precise tailoring of dark wool suits. On the night of the East Wing Gala, that frequency was a physical pressure in the air. I stood in the grand vestibule of the National Heritage Museum, watching the most powerful people in the country filter through the heavy brass and glass doors. The marble floors gleamed under the amber light of massive chandeliers reflecting the steady, synchronized movements of the federal security apparatus. I was not wearing a headset, but I had a discreet, clear acoustic tube tucked securely into my right ear, delivering a continuous stream of encrypted communication from the perimeter defense teams. I held a thick, leather-bound portfolio in my hands. To the untrained eye of a passing guest, it might have looked like a simple clipboard. To the Secret Service agents stationed at the magnetometers, that portfolio was the absolute law of the evening. It held the master manifest, the final undeniable word on who truly belonged inside the velvet ropes, and who would be swiftly escorted back out into the cold night air. True power does not announce itself. The actual billionaires, the senior senators, and the foreign diplomats who arrived that evening did not shout. They moved with a quiet, practiced grace. They handed their credentials to the federal agents with polite, murmuring voices. They did not need to prove they belonged because their presence was an established fact of the ecosystem. I stood roughly 10 feet from the primary biometric scanning station, my posture relaxed but completely alert, silently authorizing the flow of guests into the grand ballroom. My tailored black evening suit was simple, unbranded, and entirely invisible to anyone who was busy looking for flashing cameras. Then the disruption arrived. I heard them before I saw them. A heavy black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb just outside the glass doors, halting slightly past the designated drop-off zone. The valet stepped forward to open the door, but before his gloved hand could even touch the handle, the rear passenger door was shoved open with aggressive, impatient force. My sister Haley emerged first. She stepped onto the damp concrete, wearing a sequined backless gown that caught the exterior floodlights like a brilliant, frantic disco ball. It was a dress designed for a loud nightclub, not a dignified federal political event. She immediately thrust her arm out, holding a phone mounted on a metallic stick, and began recording herself. She spun around on the red carpet, her voice rising in a shrill, completely uncalibrated pitch as she narrated her arrival to her internet followers. She completely blocked the path of a federal judge and his wife, entirely oblivious to the polite frustration she was causing. My mother followed her out of the vehicle. Patricia was wrapped tightly in her emerald silk gown, clutching her heavy, glittering necklace, as if she genuinely expected someone in the crowd to sprint forward and snatch it from her throat. She looked around the entrance with wide, frantic eyes, her face set in a tight, desperate mask of manufactured superiority. She snapped a sharp, condescending remark at the valet about closing the car door too slowly, her voice carrying harshly over the polite hum of the arriving crowd. Finally, my father stepped onto the red carpet. Richard wore his custom midnight blue tuxedo with the stiff, unnatural posture of a man who was deeply uncomfortable in his own clothes. He adjusted his silk lapels, shot his cuffs to expose his thick gold watch, and puffed out his chest. He looked around the plaza with profound, staggering arrogance, drinking in the sight of the armed agents and the velvet ropes as if they had been deployed specifically to honor his personal arrival. They moved toward the grand entrance as a loud, chaotic unit. They were a parade of frantic insecurity, disguised as wealth, broadcasting their fabricated status to a room full of people who actually possessed the real thing. I watched them walk through the heavy glass doors and step into the warm, illuminated vestibule. They were exactly 30 feet away from me. The primary security checkpoint was a bottleneck designed to thoroughly verify identities before anyone could access the inner lobby. A line of perhaps 10 people had formed, moving swiftly and quietly through the scanners. My family joined the back of this line, and their total inability to adhere to basic social decorum was instantly apparent. Haley complained loudly about having to wait, shifting her weight dramatically from foot to foot in her towering heels. She loudly asked my father why their platinum VIP donor package did not include a private expedited entrance for special guests. Richard hushed her, but he did it with a smug, booming voice that echoed obnoxiously off the marble walls. He told her to be patient, declaring that security was just doing their job to keep the ordinary, unimportant people out of the building. He laughed at his own joke, a harsh, abrasive sound that caused a nearby diplomatic attaché to slowly turn his head and stare in absolute disbelief. Patricia patted Richard's arm, her eyes scanning the room, frantically assessing the jewelry and attire of the women standing nearby, silently calculating her own worth against theirs. I stood perfectly still near the scanning station, my hands resting calmly on the leather edges of my master manifest. My breathing was slow and measured. A month ago, the mere sight of them standing together, looking so united and triumphant, would have sent a sharp, agonizing spike of inadequacy straight through my chest. I would have desperately wanted to run over to them, to fix their coats, to offer my assistance, to somehow earn a small approving nod from my father. But that version of Clara was completely gone. She had been liquidated at 3 a.m. to fund the circus currently parading toward the metal detectors. I felt absolutely no emotional connection to the 3 people standing in that line. I viewed them entirely as operational liabilities approaching a secured federal perimeter. The line moved forward. The agents at the desk processed the credentials with smooth, quiet efficiency. The soft, rhythmic beep of the scanners provided a steady soundtrack to the vestibule. My family was now only 3 parties away from the front of the queue. It happened exactly when they were 10 feet from the desk. Haley was busy trying to find the perfect lighting for another photograph when she accidentally bumped into my father's shoulder. Richard turned his head to scold her, his gaze sweeping across the vestibule. His eyes passed over the armed agents, the velvet ropes, and the floral arrangements before coming to a sudden, rigid halt. He saw me. I was standing slightly behind the primary Secret Service agent, reviewing a secondary guest list in my portfolio. I did not shrink back. I did not look away. I met my father's eyes across the short expanse of polished marble. The immediate sequence of expressions that washed over his face was a masterclass in profound arrogance. For a fraction of a second, there was genuine shock. Then the shock was rapidly replaced by a dark, furious scowl. His mind, completely incapable of processing the reality of my position, immediately defaulted to the narrative he had spent a lifetime constructing. In his rigid, unyielding worldview, I was nothing more than a boring, invisible administrative drone. Therefore, to him, my presence in this opulent room could only mean one thing. I was working a menial, low-level shift. I was a hired servant holding a clipboard tasked with standing by the door while the important people enjoyed the gala. And worse, he assumed I had deliberately sought out this humiliating gig just to spy on them and ruin their glamorous evening with my dreary, pathetic existence. He tapped Patricia firmly on the arm and pointed directly at me. My mother turned her head. Her eyes widened and her mouth formed a tight, angry line. She grabbed Haley's wrist, forcing her to lower her phone. The 3 of them stared at me, their collective posture radiating sheer, unadulterated contempt. They stepped out of the organized queue. Richard ignored the polite protest of the guests behind him and marched directly toward the security desk, pulling Patricia and Haley along in his wake. He bypassed the scanning station entirely and walked right up to where I was standing. The Secret Service agent stationed at the magnetometer immediately shifted his stance, his hand moving subtly toward his radio, sensing the sudden aggressive movement. I offered the agent a tiny, imperceptible nod, silently instructing him to hold his position. I wanted to hear exactly what my father had to say. Richard stopped 2 feet away from me. He looked down at my simple black evening suit, his eyes lingering on the leather portfolio in my hands with an expression of supreme mocking pity. He did not care that we were surrounded by federal officials, wealthy donors, and silent observing guests. He only cared about asserting his dominance. "I told you to stay home, Clara." His voice was a harsh, booming bark that cut right through the refined hum of the vestibule. Several people nearby actually stopped talking and turned to look at us. He let out a loud, abrasive laugh that held absolutely no humor, only cruelty. "You're not important enough to stand here," he said, gesturing dismissively at my portfolio. "Stop embarrassing us and fetch someone in charge to scan our VIP passes." The words hung heavily in the cool, conditioned air of the museum lobby. They were exactly the words I expected him to say. They were the culmination of 33 years of belittlement distilled into a single, perfectly arrogant command. He truly believed he could snap his fingers and order me to scurry away like a disobedient child. He genuinely thought his forged platinum 5 VIP status granted him the authority to humiliate me in front of the federal government. Patricia stepped up right beside him, leaning in closely to add her own layer of poison. Her emerald silk gown rustled loudly in the quiet space. She looked at me with deep theatrical shame. "Clara, really?" She whispered, her voice carrying an incredibly sharp, biting edge. "Could you not just let us have one nice evening without following us around like a lost puppy? You are completely ruining Haley's special night. This is a secure event for important donors, not a place for you to stand around holding paper. Just do what your father says and find a manager. We do not want to be associated with the staff." Haley did not even bother to speak to me directly. She just sighed loudly, rolled her eyes, and complained to our mother that they were wasting precious networking time dealing with the help. I stood perfectly still. I did not blush. I did not stammer. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of inadequacy that used to define my entire relationship with these people. I just looked at the three of them standing there in their expensive stolen clothes, demanding to be treated like royalty. The sheer magnificent irony of the moment was almost too heavy to carry. They were standing in a federal building, holding fraudulent credentials purchased with my liquidated life savings, demanding that I fetch a manager to grant them access to a room that I personally controlled. They had walked exactly, precisely, flawlessly into the center of the trap. I looked at my father. I looked at the dark, furious entitlement burning in his eyes. I looked at the custom midnight blue tuxedo he had bought with my future. I felt the smooth leather of the master manifest beneath my fingertips. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone incredibly flat, entirely professional, and completely devoid of any familial connection. "I assure you," I said quietly, looking directly into Richard's eyes, "you have the full attention of the person in charge." The silence that followed my words was profound and absolute. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply stood my ground on the polished marble floor of the grand vestibule and let the weight of my statement press down on the air between us. My father stared at me, his thick brow furrowing in a mask of genuine, unadulterated confusion. His brain, rigidly programmed by 33 years of dismissing my entire existence, simply could not process the data in front of him. He looked at my practical beige trench coat and my sensible flat shoes, and his mind desperately tried to reject the reality of my posture. He opened his mouth fully, intending to unleash another loud, abrasive demand, fully intending to put his boring, invisible daughter back into her tiny, designated box. He never got the chance to speak. I broke eye contact with him for a fraction of a second and offered a single, imperceptible nod to the lead Secret Service agent stationed at the primary magnetometer. The agent did not draw a weapon. He did not shout. He simply stepped forward, his large frame smoothly blocking the path between my family and the grand ballroom, his presence radiating an unyielding, terrifying federal authority. At that exact moment, the sharp, authoritative click of heels echoed across the terrazzo floor. Sarah, the head of White House protocol, stepped out from the periphery of the security checkpoint. She moved with the flawless gliding grace of a woman who commanded rooms full of billionaires and global leaders every single day of her life. She wore an immaculate ivory suit, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression carved from absolute ice. She bypassed the velvet ropes entirely, ignoring the whispered murmurs of the wealthy donors waiting in line, and positioned herself directly next to my right shoulder. She looked at my father. She did not look at him with the polite, accommodating smile of a hospitality worker. She looked at him with the cold, dissecting gaze of a predator, evaluating an incredibly foolish mouse. "Excuse me, sir." Sarah said, her voice expertly modulated to carry clearly across the quieted room without ever sounding like a shout. "Are you harassing the deputy director of the endowment?" The words hung in the illuminated space, echoing softly off the soaring ceiling. The deputy director of the endowment. I watched the physical collapse of my father happen in slow, agonizing motion. It was a spectacular, devastating unspooling of a man who suddenly realized he had marched proudly into a minefield. The color drained from Richard's face in a rapid, visible wave, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray beneath the collar of his custom midnight blue tuxedo. His mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy sound emerged. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked at me, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as he desperately searched for the punchline of a joke he did not understand. Patricia gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air, the sound of a woman whose fabricated social ladder had just snapped completely in half. She stumbled backward a half step, her emerald silk gown brushing against the brass stanchion. She stared at me, her eyes tracking from the leather master manifest in my hands to the discreet acoustic earpiece coiled at my neck. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The daughter she had mocked in a hotel lobby just hours ago, the daughter she had deemed entirely unfit for high society, was the supreme authority governing the very society she was trying to infiltrate. Behind them, the fragile illusion of Haley's glamorous debut shattered completely. The polished metallic stick she had been using to film her arrival slipped right through her trembling fingers. Her expensive smartphone hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crack. The sound of the glass screen splintering resonated through the quiet vestibule, a perfect, poetic representation of her fabricated reality breaking into useless pieces. She did not even bend down to retrieve it. She just stood there, her backless sequined dress suddenly looking cheap and ridiculous in the harsh, unforgiving light of federal scrutiny. My father finally managed to find a fractured piece of his voice. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a thick finger at me. "She is my daughter," he stammered, his confident boom reduced to a pathetic, rattling whisper. "She is just a secretary. There is a massive mistake. We are Platinum 5 IP donors. We paid for the elite package. We belong in that room." Sarah did not blink. She folded her hands gracefully in front of her and offered him a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. "Sir, the only mistake made tonight was your assumption regarding the perimeter security of a federal event." Sarah replied, her tone dripping with polite, devastating condescension. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between my father and me. I opened my heavy leather portfolio. The gold and blue seal of the National Heritage Endowment caught the amber light of the chandeliers. I reached behind the laminated seating charts and pulled out the thick printed stack of papers I had meticulously assembled during my forensic audit in the motel room. I held the documents flat on the clipboard, ensuring the harsh black ink was clearly visible. I did not look at the elite guests whispering behind us. I did not look at the armed agents closing the circle. I looked directly into the terrified, shrinking eyes of the man who had actively chosen to steal my future. "Your VIP passes were secured using a forged federal endorsement," I said. My voice was incredibly clear. It carried perfectly through the space, leaving no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. I let the word forged echo off the marble walls, ensuring every powerful, influential person standing in that security line heard exactly what kind of man Richard truly was. He stared at the papers on my clipboard. He saw the printed IP routing data. He saw the time-stamped financial logs, and resting right on top, undeniable and completely condemning, he saw the counterfeit sponsorship letter bearing the stolen government seal and my perfectly traced signature. He realized in that agonizing second that I had not just found out about the money. I had found the exact microscopic coordinates of his federal crime, and I had brought the receipts directly to the gates of his own execution. "You told me you were facing prison, Dad?" I continued, my tone flat, factual, and entirely devoid of pity. "You told me the state tax board was going to seize the house. You let Mom weep into the phone about your failing heart." Patricia let out a high, ragged whimper, covering her mouth with her hands. She finally understood that her theatrical, manipulative tears had been meticulously logged as evidence. "You stole $85,000 from my life savings to buy your way to a table that I personally built," I said, driving the reality of the situation straight through his crumbling ego. "You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to purchase a costume. You thought I was too boring, too compliant, and too desperate for your approval to ever run an audit on your lies." Richard opened his mouth to defend himself. He tried to summon the old, booming arrogance that had terrorized me for decades. He puffed out his chest, attempting to pull rank on the daughter he had always viewed as property. "Clara, you listen to me right now," he hissed, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You are going to put those papers away. You are going to let us into that ballroom, or I swear to God I will never speak to you again." It was the exact same threat he had used on the phone weeks ago, the ultimate punishing ultimatum of absolute abandonment. But standing there in the seat of my own power, surrounded by the architecture of my own hard-earned career, the threat sounded so incredibly hollow and pathetic that it actually made me smile. It was a small, quiet, profoundly liberated smile. I turned my head slightly and looked at my mother, who was trembling violently in her emerald silk gown, clutching her fake diamond necklace as if it were a life preserver. "You told me at the hotel that this was a restricted crowd, Mom," I said, keeping my voice impeccably polite. "You told me to go back to my little apartment because I lacked the proper pedigree to mingle with senators. You specifically said this was a blood-only event." I turned my gaze back to my father. He was sweating profusely now, the collar of his custom shirt growing damp against his neck. "You were absolutely right," I told him, closing the leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. "It is a blood-only event, and I am cutting you off." The finality of the statement hit the air like a physical drop in barometric pressure. I did not need to issue an order. I did not need to raise my voice or point a trembling finger toward the exit. The highly trained professionals surrounding me knew exactly what to do. The lead Secret Service agent stepped smoothly past me, accompanied by 2 armed federal compliance officers. They moved with absolute, uncompromising precision. The lead agent placed a firm, heavy hand on my father's custom-tailored shoulder. He did not ask Richard to leave. He informed him that he was being formally detained for questioning regarding the presentation of fraudulent federal credentials and suspected wire fraud. My father tried to pull away. He tried to shake the agent's hand off his expensive wool jacket. He loudly declared that he was an important businessman, that this was a massive misunderstanding, and that he demanded to speak to a lawyer. The agent simply applied more pressure to his shoulder, effortlessly turning him toward the grand revolving doors. Patricia began to panic. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy socialite evaporated entirely, revealing the terrified, desperate woman underneath. She reached out, trying to grab my arm, trying to deploy the weaponized weeping that had always guaranteed my compliance. "Clara, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking in genuine, unadulterated fear. "Please, honey, do not do this to us. We are your family, we love you. We were just trying to celebrate. Please call them off." I stepped back, allowing the space between us to expand. I looked at her tear-streaked face, her ruined elegance, and I felt nothing but a deep, abiding peace. "Family takes care of family, Mom," I said quietly, repeating the exact phrase she had used to extort me for years. "I am simply letting the federal authorities take care of you now." The compliance officers flanked my mother and my sister. Haley was staring blankly at the shattered remains of her phone on the marble floor, completely incapable of processing the fact that she was being escorted out of a luxury event by armed guards. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock, but she did not speak. There were no arrogant insults left to hurl. There were no social media followers left to impress. There was only the cold, hard reality of the terrazzo floor and the heavy brass doors waiting for them. The surrounding crowd of billionaires, diplomats, and power brokers watched in absolute transfixed silence as Richard, Patricia, and Haley were marched deliberately away from the velvet ropes. They were paraded back down the crimson carpet they had strutted across just minutes before. It was a public, devastating, and entirely inescapable humiliation. The very elite society they had desperately sacrificed my future to join was now watching them be ejected as common criminals. I stood beside Sarah and watched them walk out into the dark, freezing Washington night. I watched the heavy glass doors close firmly behind them. The cold draft from the entrance faded, replaced by the warm, fragrant air of the museum vestibule. The lead agent turned back to me, offering a sharp, respectful nod to confirm the perimeter was secure and the targets had been successfully transferred to the holding vehicles. Sarah placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. She did not offer unsolicited sympathy. She offered the ultimate professional compliment. "Flawless execution, Deputy Director," she said quietly. I thanked her. I opened my portfolio, smoothed the pages of the master manifest, and turned my attention back to the security line. The disruption was over. The music from the string quartet swelled beautifully through the ambient space. The powerful machinery of the evening resumed its steady, magnificent rhythm. I stood at the gates of my own life, perfectly balanced, completely in control, and officially free from the heavy, suffocating debt of trying to earn the love of people who only valued my utility. If you have ever had to close the door on the people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever had to quietly gather your own evidence and stop funding the illusion of a family that only sees your wallet, you understand exactly how light the air felt in that room. You do not have to purchase your right to exist. You do not owe your future to anyone who treats your devotion like a limitless bank account. Share this story with someone who needs the courage to put down the checkbook and walk away. Leave a comment telling me where you found your strength, and please subscribe to join our community. Your dignity is worth far more than their approval. I will see you in the next one. Federal justice does not operate on a theatrical timeline. It does not care about dramatic irony or emotional closure. It operates like a glacier, slow cold, and absolutely capable of grinding anything in its path into fine dust. When the heavy brass doors of the National Heritage Museum closed behind my family that night, my part in their destruction was officially over. I did not need to chase them into the street. I did not need to scream my grievances into the damp Washington air. The federal government had taken the wheel, and the machine they had so arrogantly tried to manipulate was now turning its gears entirely against them. My attorney Vivian did exactly what I had paid her exorbitant retainer to do. The moment the Secret Service formally logged the criminal referral at the Gala checkpoint, Vivian filed her civil asset recovery motions. Richard had assumed his financial maneuvers were untraceable. A series of clever shell games that a small-town contractor could easily hide from a daughter he considered a naive paper pusher. He had wildly underestimated the brutal efficiency of a boutique white-collar law firm. Within 48 hours of his humiliating ejection from the museum, every single bank account holding my stolen funds was completely frozen by federal court order. The $85,000 was forcefully and legally seized. It was transferred into a secure escrow account, pending the final judgment, completely inaccessible to the man who had stolen it to buy a tuxedo and a hotel suite. But Richard did not just lose the stolen money. The federal wire fraud charges triggered a massive systemic collapse of his entire financial house of cards. The contracting business he had claimed was failing, actually was failing. But his fraud accelerated the demise into a spectacular implosion. The moment the federal investigation was opened, his business accounts were scrutinized. His local suppliers immediately dropped him, terrified of being implicated in any financial impropriety. The creditors who had been patiently waiting for their payments suddenly called in his debts all at once. The fake architectural firm he had invented for his gala ticket became the center of a federal inquiry regarding falsified corporate documents. Stripped of my life savings and facing crushing legal fees for his upcoming defense, Richard was forced to declare actual unrecoverable bankruptcy. He lost the business, he lost his remaining assets, and he lost the carefully constructed facade of the successful patriarch. The financial ruin was absolute, but the social ruin in their small Ohio town was a completely different kind of devastation. In a town of that size, reputation is oxygen. My mother had spent 30 years breathing that oxygen, sitting at the head of the church committees, organizing the bake sales, and quietly judging every other woman in her zip code. Now, Patricia was suffocating. The news of a local businessman being detained at a high-profile Washington gala for wire fraud and forging a federal document did not stay quiet. It made the regional papers by Wednesday. Patricia tried desperately to spin the narrative. She called the women in her inner circle, weeping performative tears, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a paperwork error maliciously exaggerated by a vindictive daughter. She tried to play the role of the tragic wronged mother one last time. But public federal indictments do not care about small-town spin. The church women she had led for decades simply stopped calling. The invitations to Sunday dinners dried up instantly. When Patricia walked into the local grocery store, people suddenly found the canned goods aisle incredibly fascinating, turning their backs to avoid acknowledging her presence. The community that had always allowed her to dictate the social hierarchy completely shunned her. She was no longer the respectable matriarch. She was the wife of a confessed fraudster. Haley faced her own unique brand of humiliation. The glamorous debut she had planned to broadcast to the world shattered on the marble floor of the museum right along with her phone screen. When the news of the arrest became public record, the internet turned on her with predictable speed. Her social media pages, once filled with curated, expensive, aesthetic posts funded by my money, were suddenly flooded with comments asking about the federal charges. People demanded to know if her designer dresses were bought with stolen funds. Unable to handle the reality of public shame, she was forced to delete her entire online presence, wiping out the only metric of success she had ever cared about. Through all of this rapid, catastrophic unraveling, my phone became a graveyard of their desperation. For the first 2 weeks following the gala, the voicemails poured in. They arrived at all hours of the day and night. I sat at my desk in my corner office overlooking the city and listened to them with the detached curiosity of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. The progression of their panic was entirely predictable. The first few messages were from Richard, his voice still clinging to a shredded scrap of his old authority. He demanded that I call Vivian off. He ordered me to drop the civil suit, insisting that federal prison would kill him and that I was destroying the family over a minor financial disagreement. When anger failed to produce a response, the bargaining began. My mother left rambling 15-minute voicemails, her voice thick with genuine, terrified sobbing. She begged me to remember the good times. She promised they would pay me back every single cent if I just made the federal investigators go away. She pleaded with me to remember that blood is thicker than water, completely forgetting that just weeks prior, she had told me I was not fit to stand in a blood-only room. Haley left exactly one voicemail. She did not apologize for demanding $2,000. She simply cried that her entire life was ruined and that it was entirely my fault for being so incredibly selfish. I did not answer a single call. I did not reply to a single text. I did not forward the messages to my lawyer to build a bigger case, nor did I save them to gloat over later. I listened to each one until the end, verifying that they contained absolutely zero accountability, and then I simply pressed the delete button. With each erased message, the heavy invisible tether that had bound me to their approval snapped a little more, until there was nothing left connecting us at all. One evening, about a month after the gala, I left the endowment building and took the metro back to Arlington. I walked the 3 blocks to my apartment building as the streetlights flickered on against the twilight. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. My apartment was exactly as I had left it. It was not a sprawling mansion, and it was not a luxury hotel suite. It was a beautiful, bright space with hardwood floors, thriving green plants, and a comfortable reading chair by the window. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, and every quiet corner of that space had been earned by my own hands and my own long hours. It was a sanctuary completely free from manipulation, entirely devoid of passive-aggressive comments and heavy sighs. And most importantly, it was entirely paid off. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. I did not pour a glass of expensive wine to celebrate their downfall. I reached for a bottle of sparkling water. I poured it into a simple glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface in the quiet, undisturbed air of my home. I walked into the living room, sat down in my favorite chair, and looked out the window at the glowing grid of the city. The silence in the apartment was profound, but it was no longer the heavy, anxious silence of waiting for the next family crisis to drop. It was the rich, deep silence of absolute liberation. I took a slow sip of the crisp water and let myself think about the concept of family. For 33 years, my parents had treated my love as an invoice. They operated on a transactional ledger where my worth was calculated entirely by my utility. If I paid the debts, if I fixed the problems, if I remained quiet and compliant, I was permitted to keep my small secondary seat at their table. They had convinced me that this constant state of financial and emotional extortion was simply what family required. But sitting there in the quiet safety of my own life, the absolute truth finally settled into my bones. You cannot buy respect from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding your worth. You cannot earn a seat at a table that was specifically designed to exclude you. My mother had told me I would never fit in with an elite crowd. My father had told me I was not important enough to stand in the lobby. They had looked at my loyalty and seen only a limitless bank account they felt entirely entitled to drain. They had been perfectly willing to let me drown in a sea of stolen identity and vanished savings, so long as they could stand on my shoulders to reach a higher social rung. The $85,000 was never just money to them. It was a prop. It was a costume. It was the price of admission to a fantasy they could never actually afford. And the terrible, beautiful irony was that in their desperate attempt to steal my resources, they had accidentally handed me the exact key I needed to lock them out of my life forever. I finished my glass of water. I walked into my bedroom, turned off the overhead light, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool and clean. The distant, muffled hum of the city traffic felt like a protective barrier surrounding my walls. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I did not spend a single second worrying about how Richard and Patricia were feeling. I did not worry about Haley's manufactured dramas. I did not run anxious calculations in my head about how to save them from themselves. I closed my eyes, and I slept a deep, dreamless, perfectly peaceful sleep. I slept like a woman who had finally balanced her own ledger and closed the account for good. If you have ever had to quietly rebuild your life after being taken for granted by the people who were supposed to protect you, you are not alone. Never shrink yourself to fit at a table where you are only valued for what you can provide. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me exactly where you're watching from and what time it is. I love reading every single one. See you in the next story.